Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Delta Green Operation Review. I'm Nate, lost in time and space, and I am joined with today.
I'm Innkeeper Vasoden from the Twisted Tentacle Inn.
And today we're going to be taking a look at an operation from Control Group called Sick Again.
Sick Again. And it's so fitting for the times, isn't it?
There is one little snippet that we'll get into later that I found amusing reading through this operation for this review. But before we get into the review itself, we want to warn any players out there that there will be spoilers throughout the rest of the review. So send your handler this way if you're looking to experience this scenario. As always, if you like our content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That helps our channel out a lot. Now, Vase,
yes, sir.
How are the handlers introduced into this scenario?
So this scenario basically has to do with an illness that is spreading very quickly in a town in Arizona. There's a pair of researchers who have been kind of getting into researching time travel, and they've stumbled upon something that actually Delta Green and Majestic had been working on in the 1940s and the 1960s. And it's the ship actually in real life. The ship was really a conspiracy theory, the USS Eldridge, that just disappeared in the middle of the ocean, this huge ship. And actually, there's a little Easter egg about it in the show Loki. In the second to last episode of Loki, the ship appears in the middle of this.
Whoa. We're only spoiling one thing at a time here.
Yeah, so if you're watching that show, it's going to be in there. But anyways, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't spoil more than that. But this USS Eldridge thing is it's kind of a famous thing that occurred in real life. But this scenario makes it a part of Delta Green experimentation, where they were trying to work on time travel, and the USS Eldridge reappears apparently, and somehow these researchers find stuff from this time travel experiments and run into it because they, by mistake, come across a signal that was sent from Delta Green and Majestic. So they start investigating further and experimenting further, and eventually they break through and actually make a connection into the future, and by mistake bring in a being from the future. It's just a woman, but she's so far ahead in the future that she's kind of evolved. She's very large and she has some strange features, but she's just a normal woman. But the time traveling apparently has something that was unexpected, which is there's these creatures, when you're traveling through time, they attach themselves to you, and it becomes a very highly infectious disease in a way. And that's what they brought over. They end up getting sick and dying, and then the disease spreads very quickly across this town.
And that's how the investigators get involved. The pre-generated agents, or researchers as they're called in this operation, are members of the CDC who have been brought in through an email from an emergency call from Dr. Fitz Strickland, who's one of the physicians at the local hospital in Hudson's Well, Arizona, which is where the scenario takes place. And then they're called into action, and they're debriefed once they get there from a local police officer.
The important thing to note here is that just like with all the other scenarios in Control Group, the Control Group is a book from Delta Green that's intended to bring agents into Delta Green. It's not necessarily a book for new players, but it's a book for new agents, and kind of creating their backstory of how they ended up running into Delta Green and becoming Delta Green agents. This scenario, when the agents are brought in to investigate this virus and this disease, they don't know what Delta Green is. They're not part of Delta Green. They literally are just CDC employees and CDC researchers.
As Vase said, they're not as a part of the program yet, so they don't have the resources that Delta Green would have either. They don't have access to weapons very easily. They don't have like a hotline that they can call when shit hits the fan. So the researchers are very much on their own in this operation, which is an aspect I really like. So when they arrive in town, they'll be quickly debriefed by the police chief, who will lead them to the hospital, and from there they can conduct their research pretty much however they wish. But the scenario recommends that you break it up into 4-hour segments, with the players being able to do 1 or 2 actions depending on what they choose to do.
And even though it feels a little bit mechanical and gamey, I think it works best that way. If you don't use that recommendation of breaking it up into 4-hour segments, it can turn pretty hectic. So I highly recommend that you follow that recommendation. Break up their actions. Ask each player, what are you doing for this 4-hour block? What are you doing for this 4-hour block? Keeps things consistent, keeps things easy to track, keeps things easy to manage, because this scenario gets out of hand very, very quickly. There's a lot going on at once.
And it's a sandbox too. So the agents, or the researchers, I'm going to keep doing that in this whole review. The researchers have a lot of options, and they can do whatever they want, kind of whenever they want. So you have to be prepared to let them do that and be able to come up with answers on the fly. So this operation is definitely going to require some bookkeeping on your end as the handler, but from there, the agents can do a various amount of activities, and the operation lays out what they can find depending on what they do. It goes over calling Dr. Fitzstrickland, who is their emergency contact, who has developed this, or has contracted this disease, and is, by the point when the agents or the researchers arrive, he's going to be probably locked up in his office and feeling pretty ill. So that they have the option to do that. And there's also a few other patients and personnel at the hospital that have contracted this unknown disease and are at various stages of development with the disease. And the operation goes into pretty extensive detail on the types of symptoms that the various people have, what their stage of development is when the agents arrive. And it goes over a lot of the mechanical aspects of how this disease affects a player or an NPC.
Yeah, each stage provides a different group of symptoms that you can roll a d8, and I highly recommend you do that. You roll an 8-sided die to determine which symptom they're exhibiting from a certain stage when they reach a certain stage. And you can roll more than one. So like, for example, stage 1 of the disease, they can have headache, coughing, vomiting, impairment of sensory and motor functions, and so on. And you can have them exhibit one of those symptoms or several of them, but never really all of them. That would be too much, I think.
It does recommend that you could have them roll like 1d4 or 2d4, depending on their stage of development with exposure to this unknown disease. Now, one thing the operation also pretty quickly lays out is that the agents are allowed to name or kind of come up with a coined term for this unknown disease if they happen to discover a remedy for it.
Yeah, and even though it says they can, it's extremely imperative that you do that you let them name it. As far as the development of the operation and the twist ending to really give a nice like shock moment at the very end for your players, you have to have them name the disease. You have to. If you run this scenario and you don't have them name the disease, it's not going to have anywhere near the impact when they get to the ending of the scenario. And I'll explain why later when we get to that part, but it's extremely important that they do. And the scenario makes it so that they're the ones that pretty much get to name it. Like the way that it's set up, one of them is going to be tasked with that. The scenario, you mentioned that it's a big sandbox, and that's what makes this one a little bit difficult to run. And I definitely don't think it's one that you should run if you're a brand new handler. I ran it. This was the first Delta Green scenario I ran. And I wish I had a little bit more experience when I did. And I wish my players had a little bit more experience with Delta Green when we did. It was super fun and my players loved it, but it definitely took a lot more work and a lot of winging it in my case because I was new. So definitely it's something that I recommend is don't run this as your first Delta Green scenario. So then the disease is it goes through 3 stages, right? So by the end of stage 3, people start dying, right?
Oh, yeah. And well before then, you're dealing with a decent amount of sanity loss, potentially intelligence loss. You suffer through whole slew of terrible symptoms. And if you happen to fumble one of these roles during a stage development, and I'm not really sure what else to call it, but you progress through the stages of exposure, and yeah, you end up dying by the third stage, which is onset pretty rapidly. So once you contract this disease, you don't have much time.
Which is now that you mention that, something else that I recommend when you run this scenario. Don't have the players roll for exposure to it, because they have to make a luck roll to see if they contract the disease. I don't recommend you expose them to it early, even if they come in contact with people that have it, because it is up to you. It really is up to you. Like, you don't have to force them to make their luck rolls right when they go to, when they first arrive in town, let's say. The researchers can decide to go see the victims that are in later stages. They can decide to do that early on. And if they do, they're going to be exposed to the disease if they're anywhere near the patients, which they will be. And if they contract this early on, there is a chance, if they fumble some roles, that they can lose their researcher or their agent very early in the scenario. That can lead to a moment of, okay, we need to really hurry up with this, and this is really dangerous. But it could also backfire and lead to a player feeling bad that they lost their character so early in the scenario. So I recommend one of two things. Have several researchers ready, and tell the players that they're going to be losing people, and they will be given a new researcher just to pick right up. And luckily, the way the scenario is set up, it wouldn't be too hard to have another researcher there that they can then take over. Or the other suggestion, which is what I think is the better way to do it, don't have them roll, don't have them get the infection that early into it. Make them see other people get sick first and die and go through the stages. Make them see others do that first. And then when they get the first infection, when the first researcher gets an infection, they're going to freak out if they've already seen it in others, Mm-hmm. If it happens to them first, they're not going to freak out as much. But if they see it develop in other people and then they get it later on in the scenario, it's more impactful, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that recommendation. You gotta kind of slowly reveal the monster before you do the big surprise.
So this, like you said, it's such a big sandbox in terms of, even though the location is contained, the amount of things that they can do, there's so many different avenues that they can take in different orders. It makes it so that you'll really need to have one of the agents or several of the agents kind of take the lead on this and then direct others to do it, because some people get decision paralysis and then they're not going to know what to do. They're going to get frustrated. See which agent or which player seems to be more of a leader and have them direct others. Okay, why don't you go do this? Why don't you guys go do that? Generally, in this scenario, it's probably not going to be a good idea for everybody to be doing the same thing at once, because you want to double up the efforts. In other words, doing research in your 4-hour block is great because you can start learning stuff, and you have 2 people doing that. That's also great. But if you have everybody doing that at the same time, then no one's going to be interviewing the victims, and they're going to end up dying, because it is a time-sensitive thing. You only have so much time to get information from the victims or from other people that came in contact with them. So make it clear to the players that it's probably a good idea to spread out and everybody handle a different aspect of the investigation.
Mm-hmm. And while most of the operation itself is contained within the Hudson's Wells Catholic Hospital, the agents are allowed to, go out of town and interview some of the victims' family or friends, and kind of learn what they were doing before they contracted the disease. So there is also some footwork that they can do as well, which I appreciated. I feel like a lot of these sort of introductory scenarios kind of trap the players arbitrarily, and I think this operation does a good job at kind of, doing that, giving them a focused goal, but also allowing them the freedom to kind of conduct their research how they want.
Yes, I agree with you, but it can also lead to an early discovery of what happened, or them stumbling on something by mistake and advancing the scenario much more quickly than you intended. And it's one of the things with sandbox scenarios that I always have like an issue with, because even as an experienced handler, sometimes there's nothing you can do about reeling that back a little bit. If someone stumbles onto something or gets a lucky break and advances things before you intended it, it can lead to a fairly short session. And it, it's unfortunate that can happen. I wish there was another way, but well, and I'll explain that once we get deeper into the storyline here. But yeah, it's a good thing overall, I guess. Yeah.
I do think that while there are certainly details that the players can find out early, especially about the nature of the USS Eldridge, if they happen to like go through one of the victims' apartments, I believe it's one of the doctors, right? They can go through one of the doctor's places early, and they can find some notes about him time traveling. Sure. Those details are cool, and they certainly help reveal the overarching story. But as far as the researchers are concerned, getting the disease like solved is their main objective. And I think as a handler, that should be what you stress. So like, even if they do find out this information early, you just make the disease more threatening and then have them try to like make some other clue more important than just the background information.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree with you. The most important thing is containing the disease. They're given a list of things, of goals that they have in the very beginning of the scenario. They're given a list of what they need to accomplish. That is something you may have to remind them of when if they get too caught up in the backstory and things like that. The most important thing is containing the disease, saving lives, and ensuring that it doesn't spread. But yeah, so let's kind of go a little bit deeper and detail the events that occur in the scenario. So when the researchers arrive, already a spread. There are people in the emergency room. There are already people who have died from this in the hospital, and there are different containment units where people are put in based on their level. So there's 3 levels, like you mentioned earlier, of development for this disease. And people are contained based on their development level. The players are given a table, which I highly recommend you use. It's like a graph or a chart where you can jot down the names of the people and what stage of development they're at. And looking through this graph can help you determine and find who patient 0 is. Having someone analyze this graph and interviewing the victims that are in the emergency room or in the ICU and containment units when they first arrive, it's extremely important. And that's what I was saying earlier. If the players don't get a chance, if they spend too much time doing other things before interviewing the patients that are on their way to the grave, they might miss the opportunity to interview them and get some important information as to where they were, who they may have contracted their version of the disease from. So this chart is extremely important to give to your players as soon as they arrive, so they can know exactly who is in which stage of development, and they can go and talk to the ones that are in the later stages first, so that they can get some information from them before they pass away. So that chart, I think, is integral to making this run properly. Without that chart, and the players get to fill it out as people start to develop more and more of the disease and such. And that's fun for some people. My group loved filling out that chart and seeing the developments exponentially grow as the hour blocks passed. Some of my players really enjoyed that. So they had the option to interview those people, and so let's go ahead and go into a couple of the people that are sick when the researchers first get there, and what their connections are.
So since this outbreak, the hospital also contacted the major hospital that's closest by from a town called Flagstaff, and they had some personnel from Flagstaff come by and help them out, and some of those people are also there, and they've also contracted the disease as well. So the first victim that the operation lines out is their initial contact of Dr. Fitz Strickland, who is he's the senior physician at the hospital. And if the agents or if the researchers talk to him before 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they arrive, he kind of sounds afraid, and he sounds frantic and kind of out of it. And then if they call after 3, he's already passed out, and he's probably at this point on his way to his grave.
Yep.
But if they do manage to talk to him, they can find out some various details. He talks about a local cafe that he stopped by, and he spoke to a couple of the workers there. And he also mentions something about antivirals and potential quarantine measures, and Philippa Jones, who is another victim, who died at 11 a.m. earlier that day.
Yeah, so the cafe that Strickland talks about is extremely important. The patient that is in the third stage of development, the one who's about to die when the researchers get there, is Malouf, and Ahmad Malouf, he is the one of the most important people in terms of determining where this came from, because he worked at the cafe, and the cafe is the connection to a lot of the patients that are already in later stages of development. So the feeling initially is that it's Malouf who infected everybody. And I think the players might get that impression initially. So then they shut the cafe down, and they try to figure out who was in contact with Malouf. But if you have a chance to interview Malouf before he dies, he can kind of give you a little bit more information that there was one guy that seemed a little sickly when he was working in the cafe on that day, and the players can actually go and get surveillance video to see who it is, and then maybe show pictures to some of the other patients that were in the cafe, because a couple of the other patients or a couple of the people who had family member that died that were in the cafe can confirm the identity of the person that Malouf was sickly. And as it turns out, it's one of the researchers that actually were doing the investigating into the time travel stuff. So you can make the connection that way using the cafe, and it's one of the most important pieces of evidence or information that can tie everything together for you. One other way that the researchers can find out where this came from is there was a family who had some girls who were going door to door trying to get money for some kind of like school project or something. They were going door to door, and they were greeted by someone who looked very ill, and they also contracted the disease. So they can also narrow down who that was based on which area the girls were going door to door, and the researchers can end up following that trail, going door to door in the same housing area where these girls were going, and eventually find the house where the researchers are, or where the researchers made their big discovery.
Yeah, they can also find some useful information if they search the victim's belongings. If they happen to go through Cortez's phone, they can find text messages from the researcher that was doing all these initial time travel experiments, and kind of seeing what this affair was all about, and that can be a clue to lead the investigators to research that person as well. Like you said, all of these clues eventually lead to these two researchers, right? They lead to Kayer and Langswheel?
Yeah. I'm not sure if they would pronounce it that way if they were American, but
anyway, terrible pronunciations aside,
yeah.
These two researchers, one of them is from Caltech, and another one is a physics professor who also worked at Caltech. So that's how they met, and together they started doing this time travel research. And like Vase alluded to earlier, that's how they accidentally kind of launched this being from the future into their timeline, and with her brings this unknown disease with her. The things that they can find out through researching these two will depend on various roles.
It's strange how they were kind of shunned by the community, by the scientific community, and really what ends up happening is that Delta Green are the ones that kind of had a hand in that, because she was getting too close. So they turned her into a pariah basically, and made a mockery of her, and nobody took her seriously. So she got upset and started doing the research on her own when she lost all her funding and all that stuff. She basically became a laughingstock. They were doing studies into this ghost particle emissions, repetitive pops in space-time that were coming and going in like predictable intervals. And that's kind of what led her deeper into looking into this time travel stuff. And when you find some notes from her, she finds that when you do some kind of travel in time, that you have to close the loop. And then she does this. She draws this diagram, and there's a nice little nod to Doctor Who there in her little notes in her diagram, because she draws the
TARDIS. Yeah,
the TARDIS. That's what it's called. The players can kind of put these things together based on her notes, but I feel like it's still not enough information for them to really know what was going on. But once things develop later on, then I think the players will start to put two and two together. But when they first find the notes, it's going to feel like it makes absolutely no sense. Like what does time travel have anything to do with this disease? Even with the notes, I feel like they're sprinkled in with just a few things, you know.
Mm-hmm.
One of the more important notes that they can find is actually a video, an interview with the being that came through when they opened the rift into time. When the players, if they start looking into the researchers, they can end up in their apartment. And once they end up in their apartment, they find a bunch of notes, they find a bunch of files, including this video interview of the being that came through, the woman. And the woman, Thartha, is what her name is. She speaks kind of English, but it's a different version of English, like some kind of dialect, probably from the future as the language evolved, is what I'm assuming that they're implying here. The interview kind of gives a little bit more information as to where she came from and how far ahead in the future she came from. When the players start finding all these notes and stuff, that maybe they start to put together that this disease was brought from the future. Eventually, in the apartment, they run into Thartha. And Thartha does not want any interaction with anyone because she knows that she brought the disease. And she knows that they're going to try and take her out because she is a danger to the current society. So she is well aware of what's going on, and she becomes pretty violent if you go anywhere near her. And more than likely, it's going to lead to some kind of confrontation. The thing with Thartha is she has a tattoo, and the tattoo is just like a proof of inoculation against a virus. And this is why it's important for the players to have named the disease themselves, because then they have more of a connection to the virus itself if they're the ones who named it. And when they find Thartha, she has a tattoo on her bicep with the name of the virus and a date of when she was inoculated. So that's kind of like the twist ending that will really blow your players' minds once they see this, and it'll put everything together. The notes sprinkle in the time travel and the future stuff. They sprinkle in all this information. The players will not put two and two together more than likely. But once they see this tattoo on Thartha and they realize that the disease that they named, the name of their disease, is tattooed on her, that definitely this woman came from the future. And it is the moment in the adventure that just like, whoa.
Yeah, it's the big reveal, and as such, it does cost a sanity roll for the researchers. But while all of this is very interesting, it doesn't solve the cure for the disease. So that is still something the agents will have to contend with, depending on when they find Thartha and if they kill her or if they choose to lead her to the hospital or do something else with her. It's all kind of dependent on how the researchers choose to handle that situation.
Basically, the most important thing they can do to try and end the disease is contain it so that it doesn't spread. They can try and do different experiments. They're not going to have a whole lot of time to do that. There is an MRI machine in the hospital, and even though using the MRI can actually cure the disease, they wouldn't know that, and an MRI is not a cure for anything generally, so it's not something that anyone's going to think of. But when we ran it, my players did end up using the MRI on a patient.
Oh, jeez.
When used the MRI, it could cure the disease, but it's so intense on the person that it can either lead to them dying or them going absolutely insane. Yeah, my players ended up using it on someone. The person nearly died, came out, the disease advanced, making them crazy, and then they took the gun from the deputy and shot 3 people before they were able to tackle the person. So I don't recommend the MRI being the cure.
I do think it's important that you at least lead the agents, or at least some of the researchers, down the rabbit hole of trying to treat the disease, because I do think that makes the end delivery of the big reveal with Thartha that much more shocking.
Without question, yeah. I agree with you, and besides, that's what they were sent there for anyways, right? Mm-hmm. Containment and to try and find a way to cure it or at least determine where it came from. So yeah, I agree with you. There are different ways you can try and treat it. Electricity seems to be the best way. The deputy has a taser. You can try tasering. But again, electricity can cure the disease, but it also is dangerous. It's not a foolproof plan. It can also lead to death or the disease advancing further. So electricity being one of the better ways to try and cure it, but also a very risky endeavor. The players also get like containment points when you're playing the scenario, and this will help determine the ending. So as a handler, you have to keep track of a few things. You have to keep track of who comes into contact with who, because the players aren't really going to know who's getting the disease or how it's transmitted. It's up to you as a handler. This is why I say it's not a good scenario for a brand new handler, because you're going to have a lot of bookkeeping, like Nate said earlier. You're going to have a ton of bookkeeping. You got to keep track of who comes into contact with who, make secret rolls, determine who got it, and have your own chart. So even though the players have their chart of, the developments of the disease, you're going to have your own chart, because when anyone is infected, they're in different stages. They may not exhibit some of those symptoms, and some of the symptoms that they exhibit may not necessarily be as obvious. So they may be developing and the players may not notice. So this is something you're going to have to constantly keep in mind as you're running this, in addition to handling what the players are doing. Anyone that comes into contact with anyone who is already sick, you're going to have to track that and make secret rolls. You're also going to be tracking these containment points for the players. There's a lot to keep in mind here. And it is definitely a scenario that's going to require a ton of paper and a ton of bookkeeping and such. How does Delta Green get involved with all this? Because so far it's all just disease and spreading and the researchers. So where does Delta Green come into play here?
So Delta Green will eventually send 2 FBI agents to the Hudson's Well Catholic Hospital to start doing some digging of their own into the investigation that the researchers are going on. They're going to poke their nose into anyone's business, and depending on how the researchers handle certain events, the FBI agents are going to be much more direct and much more lethal in their methods of approach versus the researchers.
Yeah, they're going to seem a little strange, a little off to the researchers, because these people work for the CDC. They've had contact with FBI before, and right away your players or their characters are going to notice that these FBI agents are not necessarily following protocol. Like you said, acting a little aggressive and a little different.
Yeah, they take possession of all their records. They start doing digging. They start mouthing off to the medical staff and kind of like telling them what to do. They very quickly try to assume control of the situation. Like Vay said, they're very serious and deadly secretive about what their intentions are. So they're not going to explain themselves. They're not going to to ask the researchers for help with anything. If anything, they're going to get in their way and try to impede on their research. They have their own hazmat suits, and they have their own supplies that they keep in a black SUV outside the hospital. And if necessary, they will also take tactical shotguns with them.
Yeah, and if the researchers decide to follow up or kind of investigate the agents and call their superiors and things like that, they start running into roadblocks as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, the typical Delta Green MOs, clearly their identities are something that they're trying to keep at low profile. So if any researcher starts trying to dig deeper into the agents, they're going to come to roadblocks, and it's going to seem even more strange, to be honest. So these agents, they are there to contain, and as if you've played Delta Green before, then you kind of know what they're there for. They're going to cover everything up, and they're there to minimize any exposure to the unnatural. So they will be extra aggressive if they ever come in contact with Dartha. They will try to kill her right away.
Which they have the ability to, given that they have giant shotguns with them.
So let me tell you what happened with my game. Dude, the way this ran in my group, man, this was just too much. So the FBI agents show up. They end up following the researchers secretly, and when they find that apartment of the people that started all this. The agents show up, right? As the researchers are knocking on the door, the agents show up, pushing their weight around. And one of my players is really aggressive. He's a murder hobo in my D&D group. And he starts getting in the agents' faces, and a scuffle comes about, and the agents kind of just bully their way through, kick in the door, and go in. And my players didn't even have a chance to read the notes from the researchers before the Delta Green people arrived, because they were so headstrong. They figured it out early, like just by pure coincidence. They went through the lead of the Girl Scout cookies. So the girls that were knocking door to door, they followed that up. And the minute one of the girls said, "Oh yeah, some lady seems sickly," one of my players is like, "That's the one. She's the one that started it all." So they figured that out super early in the scenario. They go there. The FBI agents show up. They get into a bit of a scuffle. The FBI agents kick the door down. They go into the apartment. Dartha comes out, throws one of my players against the wall. The agents shoot Dartha in the head and kill her right away.
Oh my God.
And then my players tackle the agents, kill one of them. They kill one of the agents, and then they beat up the other one and tie her up next to Dartha, who then infects her, and then she dies. So They literally killed the 2 Delta Green agents. Yeah, that's how it went down.
So, yeah, needless to say, players always bring unexpected surprises.
Yeah. Don't make this your first Delta Green game for your group. Let your group know what Delta Green is, so at least they can, even though it's metagaming, at least they can understand that that's not what they're going to want to do.
Yeah. So I like the aspect of the FBI agents. I think for more experienced groups with Delta Green, that seeing the FBI will definitely throw off a red flag for them. That's gonna be like, okay, this something isn't right here. And I think a lot of players might tail the FBI, kind of see what they're doing and see what they're up to. And I think that as a plot device or a plot MacGuffin, you can certainly use these 2 FBI agents to great effect. You can use them to kind of lead them to clues that you want the players to find, or you can sort of make the scenario move forward without having to kind of force the players into a certain particular path. You
can use them definitely to your advantage, so that it's good that they're there because of that. And it's a nice tie into Delta Green, because later on, the purpose is later on, then you can use those agents to try and recruit the researchers into Delta Green, and then that could be the backstory of your new Delta Green agent. So this scenario can play out as this is how your play groups people became involved with Delta Green. Pretty much as in most of the scenarios in this book, that's what the intent is the scenario is characters who are not part of Delta Green, never heard of Delta Green, and how they got introduced into Delta Green. Should they survive?
Mm-hmm. Should they survive? We go into a bit of a debriefing, right?
Yeah. So a lot can happen depending on how they handle this. Again, because it's so open, there's just so much that can occur at the end. And so you want to kind of tally up the containment points that you've been assigning throughout the scenario, and that'll determine the outcome of the disease and how it's spread later as time goes on. The researchers themselves, they have a lot of options here based on how they handle it too. If they try to go national and try to get the governor to issue like an emergency, it can have political ramifications. So bad things can happen there. There's just so much that can happen. They can be fired. They can go under a Senate hearing or something, and basically get completely ostracized from the medical community for their handling of this situation if things got really bad. There's so many different ways this can play out, and it really, honestly, even more ways than it even shows in the debrief here, because how your players handle this can go so many different ways, and it's so open that really a number of different things can occur here. But regardless of that, the thing that actually will be more specific is how the disease ends up spreading, if it ends up spreading. And that's completely based on the mechanical element of the containment point. So if the players are able to do well and get a high number of containment points, then they're able to keep a lid on things and the disease doesn't spread that much, and that's where they earn a sanity reward. But if they get a lower amount of containment points, either way, like the disease ends up cropping up in years later, like it'll show up in different parts of the world, and it has little blips where it spreads for a little bit and then goes away. Because it spreads and kills people so quickly on its own, it tends to kind of die out. It kind of just like a big spike and then dies out. And so there's little blips like that every few years that occur around the world. If they have very few containment points, then things get really bad around the world every few years or every few months even. Yeah, it can get really bad with this disease based on how the players handle it.
Ultimately, their fates wind up in Delta Green in some fashion. Whether the agents are alive, the two agents that get sent from Delta Green in this operation are still alive or not. It'll either be them or their case handler that will contact them and say, hey, like, we saw what you did out there. You know too much now. You're going to have to come with us, essentially. And how the players react is outlined, whether they choose to cooperate or not. You can basically put them in the situation where they're going to join Delta Green, whether they like it or not. So
whether they like it or not, because if they don't cooperate, then Delta Green has ways.
Yeah, they'll publicly embarrass the player characters, like calling, basically
they'll lose their job, their career. They're going to be completely destroyed. Their lives will be destroyed, and they'll be discredited. So anything they try to do to expose Delta Green will make it look like they're just loony, and they'll get they're not going to be able to get that out there. Even if they try to expose them and say that, oh yeah, there's the secret society or whatever, they're just going to look like fools.
Yeah, they're going to be like, the lizard people of the world, essentially. So,
exactly.
But that's really about it as far as the plot goes. The rest of the operation goes into statting out some of the key NPCs that the agents or the researchers will meet throughout the course of this operation, and then it gives you some really nice handouts and the development and research notes sheets that Vase was alluding to earlier that I would also very much recommend you give your players to use. And I would also recommend that handlers fill this out themselves as well with the hidden information that they need to keep things organized, because a lot of moving parts in this operation. So why don't we go into what we like about Sick Again?
I love the disease portion of it. There's not any Delta Green or Call of Cthulhu or D&D scenario that I've played that has this kind of aspect to it, and it's really cool. Like when I was playing this, when I was running this, my players were like, "Oh, this is like," they said the game. There's a game, I guess, that's got disease. That's about containing disease.
Pandemic?
Board game. Pandemic. Yeah. They're like, "Oh, this is like Pandemic, the RPG," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's not what Delta Green is, but this scenario definitely feels that way." And it's handled. That's handled pretty well. The way everything is very meticulously laid out to help you evoke this feeling of this thing spreading and how dangerous it is. And the disease itself is very, very scary. I love the way that can definitely invoke a feeling of dread in people and just fear and just like, oh, especially now that, COVID is a thing. I think people are even more like, oh, wow, this is really relevant and this can definitely happen. So I like that aspect of it. The twist at the end was fantastic. I think the twist can really bring a moment of, oh my God, this is awesome, if it's done properly. So if they're able to see the tattoo on Thartha and put two and two together, that can be amazing. And I really like the way it's handled in terms of the researchers come in just to try and handle this outbreak that's clearly out of their range or their purview, and they don't even realize it. They don't realize what they've gotten themselves into. And as the story develops, they start to realize that they're in over their heads, but there's nothing that they can do because they're already in the thick of it. So I really like that aspect of it. What about you?
I like that aspect of it too. And I like that this operation can serve as a genesis for a long running campaign as you get your agents involved as CDC covers for Delta Green. And there are a bunch of really awesome operations that involve the CDC with Delta Green. You have operations like Visid, Extremophilia, Last Equation. Those are all scenarios you could easily tie in with this scenario and make for a really interesting kind of research campaign style project, which would be fun. But another thing that I like is I like the handouts. I think that this is one of the better operations as far as handouts go. They're very well done, and they have a lot of nice little details about them that I really enjoyed. And I think that they serve the plot more than detract from it. That's
Without
one
question.
That's one criticism we've had of handouts in the past, is that once you start handing your players like journal entries that are 5 pages long, they tune out, and then the game kind of comes to a halt. And these handouts are short and they're quick, and you read them in a couple of minutes, and they're very concise in the information that they lay out, which is, I think, the right way to do a handout.
I totally agree with you. I think the handouts are very well done. Even the one that's a little bit longer, the Thartha video, it's a quick read because it's like just almost written like a play in a way.
Yeah, it's a script essentially.
Yeah, script. Yeah, and so it reads quickly. It's not, even though it seems like it's a couple pages, it's very short in reality, and so it won't take a lot of time. I agree. The handouts are very, very good quality. The usefulness on each one is there. Like none of them are just there just for, oh, let's just give a handout for the sake of giving a handout. Like they're all helpful in one way or another. I agree with you. The handouts are very well done.
Not only are they well done, but they're easy to implement. Like I think the operation does suggest that you kind of lay them out through the researcher's apartment, but I feel like you could easily sprinkle some of these throughout either the cafe, like maybe it dropped out of their pocket, for instance, or something like that. There's one handout that's like a memo from the EPA about PPE, and you could certainly have that in the hospital. Not only are they really well done, but they're also really well implemented within the operation itself.
What I would change, I think there are a couple things for me. The most important for me is the focus on PPE. So I understand, because I studied forensics. Like we had several courses just on PPE and proper use and when to use it and all that stuff. So I get it. But at the same time, even though this is a scenario all about disease and disease spreading, the PPE is all useless. It doesn't protect you from any of it, right? So I feel like there's too much focus on it. And I know exactly what they were going for. They're trying to get your agents to read through all this and to be meticulous about wearing their PPE and all this stuff. But in the end, it's not going to make a difference whether they're using it or not. So I think that instead of spending several pages talking about personal protective equipment, it should be like, okay, you guys are highly trained in personal protective equipment. You have a bunch of all this stuff, and just briefly break it down. You have this full suit, this, that, and the other, and that's it. And then there's a whole crew, like the cleanup crew afterwards, if you're getting anywhere near the infected people. Mention that early on in the scenario, and mention it to your players early on, and move on from it. Like don't go too much into PPE. I'm okay with the part where if like a suit tears, you lose some sanity, because that would freak you out. Mm-hmm. But other than that, spending that much time and I'm sure some groups are going to have their players like really get meticulous about what equipment they're wearing for every scene that they're going to be doing. So every 4-hour block, okay, I'm going to put this suit on and these gloves on and the self-contained breathing apparatus and all this stuff. Like, assume that they're putting on whatever is required for the place where they're going, and don't harp too much on that, because even though you're trying to provide some kind of red herring, all it's going to do is detract from the fun. In my opinion, it's going to make people focus on the wrong thing, and then when they realize that it's not going to help in any way, they're not going to feel like, oh, cool. They're going to feel like duped, like, oh God, so why do you make me go through all this?
Yeah.
So I think that such a high focus on PPE, even though it seems appropriate from a bird's eye view, in practice, it doesn't work the way you think it's going to work. Just kind of briefly mention it. Assume that they're wearing the protective equipment necessary for the particular scene that they're going to be at. The other thing I would change, I feel like there weren't enough NPCs that are interesting enough in this one. I wish that there was a little bit more in terms of interesting characters for the players to meet and interact with. And I get that the handler's going to have their hands full doing notes, but as a handler, I have fun running NPCs. That's the most fun I have as a handler, is running NPCs. There's not much to play around with here.
Yeah, you really have like the 2 agents, because...
Yeah.
all of the other NPCs introduced in this operation are likely to either have the disease or get the disease and die throughout the course of the operation. So, yeah, like you said, you already kind of have your hands full, but I would definitely agree that there isn't much for as far as role playing goes, unless you're sort of into the, like you said, that kind of meticulous note keeping and bookkeeping of studying the victims and doing treatments and like researching symptoms and stuff like that. Unless your players are really into that sort of thing, there isn't a lot of role playing opportunity in this scenario. I would agree with you there.
So those are the main things that I think that would change. What about you?
I think for me, one of the biggest gripes I had going through this operation was just the way the information is laid out throughout the operation. It feels very scattered amongst all the pages. The operation begins by kind of giving you a brief introduction, and then it immediately goes into the PPE. Like Vase was saying, it spends a lot of time going into the PPE and like decontamination from the PPE, and then like a few pages later it goes into the scenario background, and then it continues to go into the exposure of the disease. And it's like all the information is there that you need, but it's also scattered around the pages that it becomes more of a chore to read through and understand than I feel like it really needs to be.
I can totally agree with you on that. When I ran this, I read through this scenario 3 times and took notes. And then I printed the handouts and took notes on the handouts. Then I went back and read it. It definitely is one that takes a lot of prepping. So you're right. It is not laid out in the easiest of ways. There are some Delta Green scenarios where there are charts scattered throughout that help you kind of have a bunch of information that's pertinent all in one place. This does feel like it's a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, like PX Poker Night, I think is a really good example of an operation that has that sort of detailed information. It has a chart that kind of goes over the hour by hour progress of what happens to the people on the Air Force Base, which I think this operation really could have used because of the time-sensitive nature of the disease itself. It would have been nice to just have that information very clearly laid out instead of kind of it being scattered through amongst various paragraphs and other pages. Another kind of gripe that I have, the naming of the disease itself, while I do think it serves the important narrative purpose that it needs to serve, I do think that at the very least you should have something to identify it with when the players start the scenario. Their case manager should call it something. I wouldn't just say like unknown disease. I would call it like Hudson's Wells syndrome or something along those lines that the players can at least reference it as while they're doing their operation, and then let them name it once they get down there and they kind of find some useful information and then have the big reveal at the end with Thartha.
Yeah, I don't know. I know where you're coming from. I don't know that I agree necessarily. It's kind of a tough thing here because although I'm with you on the fact that it's weird that it wouldn't have a name yet once it's already spread. At the same time, if you have it be named in one way or another, like you said, the Hudson's Well thing, then you risk the players calling it that the rest of the scenario and not bothering naming it with a proper name and just keeping that name. And then it's not as impactful. Like that. I feel like the naming of the disease is something that has to be done by the players so they have that connection. Like I came up with that name and this lady has it tattooed on her arm. Hudson's Well, like if they already had named it when they get there, I feel like they won't put as much thought into that when they see the tattoo.
True. But I do feel that there are going to be players that name it like poo poo papa disease or something. They're going to try to name it something stupid. And
my group did too. My group gave it a dumb, I can't remember what it was, but I remember it was a really stupid name, but that's why it made such a big impact because what else could it have been on her arm?
Right. And it's, like that to me, it's just kind of silly in a way that I don't think Delta Green handles very well. Like I think you could do that in a Call of Cthulhu scenario, for instance, because like you said, that the tone of that game is a little different, but Delta Green is a very gritty game. And I think once you kind of introduce that silliness component to it, you're kind of dampening the mood a bit, I think.
I agree with you. This was our first game. My group had no idea what Delta Green was. They went kicking doors in and murder hoboing everybody, and then I had to teach them a lesson. And then they realized what Delta Green was afterwards. Like, so that's why I always, when I talk about introducing Delta Green to your play group, if you play like other games that are not Call of Cthulhu, people from Call of Cthulhu will get it. But anyone who plays like D&D or other stuff and tries to get into this game, it's hard because your players are going to be used to killing everything. And so that's what happened to us. So the only reason they named it something immature was because this was the mood that they were expecting because of D&D. And this should have never been the first scenario we played. But here we are. But I don't know. I think not all groups are immature like that. Not all groups are going to name it Poo Poo Papa or whatever.
True.
So, I mean, I think it just depends on the group. I think giving them the power to come up with that is so important. And I think that most people, once the seriousness of the scenario is in play, I think most people will take it seriously enough to name it something serious.
Yeah, one would hope at the very least.
So true.
But I think apart from that, there is really a lot of great stuff going on in this operation. It requires a lot of work on the handler to keep things organized and keep this operation running smooth. I think more so than any other operation we've reviewed so far. This one has so many moving parts you need to keep track of. I think this is a really intimidating scenario to run. And I'm very surprised that you would choose this as your first one.
Yeah, it was crazy of me, man. I mean, overall, it didn't go super well. My players had a great time, but there were a lot of elements that could have been done better if I had more experience with Delta Green when I ran it. So I, again, reiterate, don't run this as your first Delta Green scenario. Do not. This book, in fact, this whole book, Control Group, gives the impression that it's for new players because it's for new agents. So that's a big difference there. This book, Control Group, is meant for, I think, for players who are experienced, who now want to come up with stories of how certain agents were introduced into Delta Green. And that's what these scenarios are. They're just ways for new agents to be introduced into Delta Green, but definitely not for new players. And I haven't read through all of the scenarios in this book, but the ones that I've read, most definitely all of them are not for new players. I wouldn't recommend a single one for a new player. So I wouldn't buy this book as your first Delta Green book. Go with something else instead. Like Night at the Opera is better for that. Or
Black Sites, I think.
Or Black Sites. Yeah, Black Sites has some really good intro ones.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Control Group is definitely one of those books that is, I think, intended for more experienced players and handlers, because the operations in them are, they're not easy to run. Like this one, for instance, it has so many moving pieces. It's going to be difficult. And like you said, it assumes that the players know what Delta Green is and what Delta Green is about. And you want to create agents with a unique backstory and actually run them through that backstory. So this book is great for invested veteran players, I think, more than it is for newer handlers and players.
And not to mention, it doesn't really give you all the tools that you would have as a Delta Green agent. None of the scenarios here do, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have the connections. You don't really have bonds yet. You don't have a lot of the things that would help you as a Delta Green agent. So as a player, even more so, you'd have to be experienced enough to know, okay, so this is a limitation now. Whereas a new player, if you read the player's handbook, right, then you'll be like, or the agent's handbook, sorry, you'll be like, okay, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. But then you play the scenario as your first scenario. You're like, okay, all that's out the window because I don't get any of that. So definitely, I think it's intended for more experienced players. I would definitely recommend this scenario though once you are experienced, because it's a really fun and cool game. It's almost its own game on the side, from typical Delta Green. If you want something a little different and you've been playing a lot of intense Delta Green scenarios that have to do with more action or the unnatural and stuff, this scenario is taking a step in a different direction, not a lighter step, definitely not a less intense step either. It's just a completely different experience than a typical Delta Green scenario because it's such a unique concept for Delta Green.
It feels almost more paranormal investigation than it does kind of conspiracy, typical kind of Delta Green, like fight against the unnatural sort of operation, which I do agree is interesting kind of line to go in with something like this, because I think it's very easy to kind of have a scenario outline like this where you have this outbreak and it ends up just kind of being, I don't know, say it's like a fungal infection from something from Shub-Niggurath, or it's, you know, some mind-bending disease from Hastur, and like that becomes kind of a very easy trope, whereas this scenario takes it in a completely different direction that I think is interesting, and it brings it into like real life conspiracy theory too, which is cool.
Any other final thoughts on this scenario?
No, I would definitely recommend this to experienced handlers who are looking for a different style of Delta Green operation. I think this is an operation you could pretty easily interject into an existing campaign if your players are already sort of in that line of work, whether they are CDC agents or maybe they work for the EPA or something like that. I think it'd be pretty easy to incorporate very many occupations into a scenario like this. Like you could have them be like members of the National Guard that get called down to, contain the quarantine, and they kind of do their own research from that point, or something along those lines. So I think that with enough work, with the right play group, that this operation can be a really great time, but does require, I think, the most amount of work from the handler I think I've seen in a Delta Green operation to date.
There is one that takes a lot of work as well, the Star Chamber, but we'll do that one way another time. That one's really cool though. But I think that does it for this one. So next one, that we're going to go through the whole book of Control Group. So we'll review the next one soon as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure chatting with you as always, Face.
As always.
I've been your host, Nate, and I was joined with
Innkeeper Vase Odin from the Twisted Tentacle Inn.
And we will see you all in our next review.